And the room. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Zoominar today about breaking down the barriers in commercial real estate. I'm Andie Marais, Associate Dean at Fordham School of Professional and Continuing Studies, which is the home of Fordham's Real Estate Institute, or REI as we call it. We are delighted to be partnering with the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors and their for today's event. REI has a strong focus on commercial real estate, which comes through in our curriculum for our master's programs in real estate development and construction management, as well as our professional certificate programs, and even our undergraduate degree programs for professionals in real estate. I encourage you to check out our website. It is truly a pleasure to introduce Richard Haggerty, CEO of HGAR, a group that he's been with for more than 35 years. Richard is also president and chief strategic growth officer of One Key MLS, the multiple listing service for New York. Richard, I know you've knocked down your share of barriers over the years on a number of levels, and you continue to advocate for fairness and ethical policies in the real estate industry. And I really appreciate the work you've done today to pull this group together so we can dip into the panel's insights. Thank you so much.
Andie, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to partner with Fordham University's Real Estate Institute to host this special event, Breaking Down Roadblocks in Commercial Development. And Andie, it's just such a pleasure to work with Fordham. You guys are great partners. And I think that you achieve so much to try to create a true professionalism in the commercial marketplace. So we really appreciate all of your efforts. As Andie noted, I'm the CEO of Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors. We're a not-for-profit trade association representing more than 13,000 real estate professionals in Manhattan, the Bronx, Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, and Orange counties. Our commercial and investment division comprises brokers, property owners, managers, developers, lenders, and other businesses associated with commercial real estate. I'm also the president and chief strategic growth officer of One Key MLS, a comprehensive multiple listing service for the New York region. New York One Key MLS currently has over 44,000 subscribers and serves the region from Montauk to Manhattan to Monticello. When I checked this morning, One Key had actually over 1,550 commercial listings. So it's not just a residential platform, it also has a significant portion of commercial listings as well. We believe in collaboration and sharing best practices for conducting business. Together, we can all work smarter. Thank you to Fordham and to this incredible panel of experts. We're pleased to have our Commercial Investment Division President, John Barrett, moderate our discussion this morning. John is Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Investment Sales for RM Friedland. John is a veteran commercial real estate broker working in Westchester, Fairfield, and the Bronx markets. John entered the real estate industry as a commercial property owner and investor 30 years ago. He began his brokerage career at Massey Nagle, now Cushman Wakefield, where he spent 9 years and led the top-ranked firm's expansion into the Westchester County market. John specializes in the sales of income-producing assets of all types: multifamily, retail, office, development sites, industrial, and user properties. John, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Andie and Fordham, for sponsoring today's event. I'm really excited about today's event. We have 4 tremendous speakers, all of whom we could have spent an hour discussing various topics today. First, though, I'd like to introduce our sponsor for the day, Statewide Abstract. And from Statewide, we have Matt McAllister. Matt?
Thanks, John. So my name is Matt McAllister. I am 3rd generation here at Statewide Abstract, which has been family owned and operated for over 40 years. Providing title insurance in Westchester County, 5 boroughs, and all surrounding counties. And for our commercial work, we have taken that to various states around the country. So we've been partnering with developers on really countless projects over the years just to try and make sure that they proceed successfully. And, so before you start building, it's important to know what you can and cannot do on the land. And that's kind of where the title report and our expertise comes into play. You're going to face various restrictions with covenants and restrictions, easements, setbacks, land use restrictions, environmental conservations, basically there's these invisible rules that the land carries with it that you might not know of when you're getting all excited and envisioning your project. So being able to partner with a title company like Statewide will help you identify these things and illuminate what you can and cannot do before you break ground, so that you know you're starting your project on a strong foundation. And we've got as John said, a very esteemed panel here. So as we dig into it more, I'm sure you'll learn more insight about how to make sure your projects go through correctly. So John, I'll flip it back to you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, of course.
For our participants in the audience today, we will have a question and answer session towards the end of the program. You can type your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. For our panelists, I'd ask you not to mute once we start, because I'd like to make this a conversational program today, and I'd like you to feed off each other. Today's panelists are Rella Fogliano, founder and chief executive of McAllister Development and McAllister Construction Management. Since 1983, the companies have specialized in the financing, design, and construction management of multifamily, affordable housing, and commercial properties. McAllister Construction has been listed in Crain's as the 17th largest women-owned company in the New York area. Rella is passionate about bringing beautiful, affordable, and mixed-income multifamily housing to residents of New York City and Lower Westchester. Her motto is to blur the lines between affordable and luxury housing. To that end, she immerses herself in the design process so that every building is unique. In the past 10 years, Rella has committed to energy efficient building, and all of her projects must meet LEED certification. She is further raising the bar by incorporating healthy living for her tenants through programs like FitWell. Rella holds a bachelor's degree from Fordham University in both communications and French, but her experience in construction came as a young girl from the age of 6 as she visited construction sites with her dad, a prominent general contractor in New York. Today, McAllister has a portfolio of over $140 million in completed projects, and it has an anticipated pipeline of $250 million worth of projects to be developed in the next 5 years. Next on the panel, we have Arthur Collins, principal of Collins Enterprises. Art is the co-founding principal and president of Collins Enterprises, a real estate development and management company focused on urban redevelopment in metropolitan markets from Virginia, Washington to Boston. Founded in 1991, the company specializes in urban mixed-use development, including apartments, retail, and office space. Art has been a member of the Urban Land Institute for 35 years, where he is a key leader and chairman of the Westchester Fairfield District Council. Mr. Collins has been a trustee for the Conway Graduate School of Land Planning and a real estate advisor for Kent School in Connecticut. He is often asked to speak on land use and creative urban design at Yale, Columbia University, and Pace University, where he is an active member of the Land Use Law Center at Pace Law School. Art holds a BS from the University of Oregon and a master's degree in urban design from the University of Pennsylvania. Next, we have Eon Nichols. Eon is a partner and vice chair of the real estate, corporate, finance, and nonprofit groups at Cuddy Fader. His practice includes all aspects of real estate transactions, both commercial and residential, real estate financing, commercial lending transactions, and leasing. He represents many nonprofit organizations in real estate transactions, real estate financing, and other corporate matters. Eon also represents companies, organizations, and businesses on a variety of corporate transactions, such as formation, governance, employment agreements, joint ventures, and other corporate matters. He is also involved in public finance transactions, such as IDA bond financing, and represents many borrowers, among them not-for-profit corporations and for-profit corporations, in tax-exempt and taxable bond financing, as well as industrial development agency straight lease transactions. And last but certainly not least is Noam Bramson, mayor of New Rochelle. Noam has served as mayor of New Rochelle since January 2006 and has been reelected 4 times by landslide margins, most recently in November 2019. Prior to becoming mayor, Bramson served for 10 years as the New Rochelle City Council. Noam has been at the forefront of efforts to strengthen New Rochelle's economy, environment, safety, and quality of life. Noam grew up in New Rochelle and is a product of its public schools. After college and graduate school at Harvard, he returned home to New Rochelle to raise his own family and make a positive difference in his hometown. One of the ways Noam has made a positive difference is through a well-designed and well-executed smart redevelopment plan in downtown New Rochelle, which has become a model and gotten press nationwide. So with that, Noam, I'd like to throw it out to you and say, all of our panelists have been successfully negotiated the development process. New Rochelle stands out as a shining example of what can be done. How did you get to where you are today with almost 7,000 units approved and or under construction?
Well, first of all, John, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with a group of panelists whom I respect greatly and delighted to be a part of this conversation. So New Rochelle has had a pro-growth philosophy for a generation now. We've been eager to attract transit-oriented development. But we discovered, notwithstanding a few successes, that despite that desire, it was hard to attract that investment because many in the real estate community perceived New Rochelle to not be presenting a positive risk-reward ratio. Our economy was seen as insufficiently mature to command the kind of rent levels that many developers were looking for. At the same time, as with approval processes elsewhere, there were multiple veto points, a likelihood that approvals would drag on for an extended period of time, and certainly no guarantee that they would ultimately land in the right place. So we really needed to change that dynamic, change that narrative in order to make it clear to the real estate community that New Rochelle was a place where business could be conducted successfully. We did that in late 2015 through a framework with several components. A master development agreement with RXR Realty, which has an enhanced opportunity to develop on publicly owned properties within our downtown area. That sounds a good signal to the rest of the market because RXR, I think, is a respected organization. A form-based zoning code that covers the entire 300-acre downtown redevelopment area. Form-based code is very flexible with respect to use and therefore market responsive, but highly prescriptive with respect to design. So all the best planning practices that we know contribute to a walkable, pleasant physical environment are hardwired into the code. And finally, maybe most importantly, we completed a generic environmental review for our entire build-out scheme. The 7,000 housing units that you mentioned, 12 million square feet of total build-out. So we invested heavily upfront in the public dialogue necessary to define that vision, in the political approvals necessary to certify that vision. And as a result, specific projects that fall within that envelope do not need to go through their own extensive environmental review with all of the political checks and balances that are ordinarily associated with it. And therefore, if someone comes to us with all the information necessary, we can get them to site plan approval within 60 to 90 days. And so what we've discovered is that predictability and that speed are absolutely essential. And the results have been remarkable. Since adoption of that framework, we've approved 30 significant projects. 6 of them are completed and are leasing up at a rate exceeding expectations. 11 of them are under construction, some of them nearly done in the pre-leasing phase. Several more are going to begin construction within the next few months. So it's been a flood of investment of a kind that we've never experienced before. And for those of us who've been working so hard to really help New Rochelle's downtown achieve its potential, it's been thrilling.
Great.
Hey, John.
Rella,
Hey, John.
go ahead.
Yeah, you wanted a conversational, so I'll just jump in. You know what the mayor said, and I've told him, and I tell all my clients, in addition to what the mayor said, what they have done in my world, in the IDA world, the so-called pilot, is they've given clarity to what it is, the benefits that you can get if you're looking for IDA financing. I get calls from all developers, Art being one of them, who says, I'm doing a project in so-and-so, and what can I get? I said, I don't know. I said, and I say this to my clients, if this was New Rochelle, we'd have clarity. You can go on their website and you know exactly what you can get, which is going to help you for your pro forma and your lenders. So that, I think, is just, having that clarity and being able to communicate to developers exactly what they can get in terms of a pilot really helps and gives certainty to folks who want to develop there. And that in my world has been huge. I see that when I look at other municipalities where there's no clarity in terms of a pilot, and deals linger for years, months.
Rella, you're developing in New Rochelle. What attracted you to New Rochelle?
I have. I was introduced originally to New Rochelle, although I'm a neighbor because I live in Eastchester and I work out of Pelham. But I first became acquainted with New Rochelle back in 2008 or so with the New Rochelle Housing Authority. They needed a for-profit developer to develop at the former Hartley Homes because the Hartley Homes was an old HUD developed project, I think dating back to 1948. There were 5 buildings that were all linked to one mechanical room. It was just not very, very good. And so I really came in after the plan was made by New Rochelle to create townhouse style homes. So that would invigorate the area and open up the tenants to more of a community style living as opposed to 5 buildings with corridors. So we recently built a park, so that fosters more of a sense of community. But I have to agree that working in New Rochelle, I mean, we have our challenges everywhere, but is a breath of fresh air. Because exactly, we sat across from the mayor. That's not something you often do in municipalities. I've spent most of my career in the boroughs of New York City, and there is much more clarity, and I love working in New Rochelle. So I agree with that wholeheartedly.
With that, I guess the commercial for New Rochelle ends right now. We'll talk about other things, if that's okay.
I'd like to continue in this vein for the next hour.
I don't blame you. But we are working in other communities as well. I mean, the building behind me is a 17-story building that we recently completed in Mount Vernon. I was in Mount Vernon for about 30 years, and sometimes you don't look in your own backyard. And I finally decided to look in my own backyard. I was mostly, as I had mentioned before, the 5 boroughs. And so the first building that we did, I was looking at the Avis station for years. I'm sorry, the Avis rent-a-car. And for years and years at the corner of McAllister and Mount Vernon Avenue. And I decided we need to do something with that. But some of the challenges of affordable housing is the good old NIMBY, so that's one of the challenges that we have to come around, because it really doesn't matter what community you're in. There's always, the surrounding neighbors think that you're going to bring down the community as opposed to lifting it up. Especially in this particular part of Mount Vernon, which was totally industrial. I mean, it was a mixed bag of single and 2-family house and a lot of industry and all of that. So the first development we did is known as the Modern, and I believe that we brought up the area. As a matter of fact, there's now a lot of properties that are selling. A lot more development is in the works in Mount Vernon. So I think we were requested was sort of a pioneer to start there, which I think could be a very good thing.
Okay. Art, you're
Yeah.
developing in the corridor from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C. Is development significantly different outside the area?
Right, John. Well, thanks. Some great comments from the rest of the panelists, and completely accurate to what's sort of plaguing this area, Westchester, Fairfield, for getting new private investment into this area. I liked Eon's commentary about, with the exception of some of the communities, maybe White Plains, certainly New Rochelle, you really don't know what you're going to face when you're looking for financial incentives or just simple entitlements for projects in and around the 65 communities in Westchester. I'm old enough to remember that Westchester and Fairfield experienced incredible growth in the 80s with corporations moving out of the city, and population growth, job growth, and we just remember. I remember that during that time there was virtually no traffic, no jam ups on 95 or 287, and that era has gone by. But I just recognize that places like New Rochelle, where there is a pro-business administration and they have a master plan and they have some element of financial incentives, that is the formula that Rella's talking about as to how to and which communities to develop and invest your equity dollars. Right now, our research, and we've been doing a fair amount of it in Westchester. I mean, there's virtually no job growth. These areas are suffering. There's aging housing stock. There's outdated zoning, and there's a lengthy process that is a lot of times uncertain and very costly to get any kind of approvals. There's also a series of areas in Westchester where there's, vacant, obsolete buildings that don't have parking, and then a resistance to having any kind of change from the NIMBYism that Rella was talking about, across the county. Biggest thing that is affecting, us in a private investment and also to get deals financed, is the rising tax environment in Westchester, especially, and it's happening in Fairfield. I mean, our infrastructure is crumbling. I guess we got to pay for that with the tax code changes, but it's driving without financial incentives is driving development away. We are doing public-private deals in and around Washington, D.C., outside in Virginia, and the environment is completely different. There's 2.5% population growth. There's job growth. There's and the public is your friend there, similar to the public administration is your friend. So we'd like to try to get that culture infused in some of these municipalities, especially in Westchester and Fairfield, because we do need job growth here. We need population growth, and I agree with everything Noam just put through, and he's been working on it for 15 years to make it work, and it's starting to come true. So it's been a long time coming, but he's done a great job in New Rochelle, and so I'm sort of carrying the torch, trying to figure out either through ULI, some of the other associations like PACE, to try and get the word out on how to reinvigorate and get private investment back into Westchester, so we can get housing and new jobs, and that's a mission that I've taken on.
Certainly the Westchester County Association and the Building and Realty Institute are both pushing that, the lack of affordable housing in this area and the barriers to building any type of multifamily housing outside our big cities. Pivoting off that, Eon, Art mentioned you can't get a deal done without IDA. I mean, are you representing or your firm representing any clients who are not seeking IDA incentives?
When you're talking about sort of in the development world, that Art and Rella does, the answer is no. I mean, it is at this point, this juncture as to where we are, because a state like New York is so expensive on a number of fronts, labor, the taxes, the mortgage tax, for example, that you have to pay on a mortgage, residential or commercial. It's unheard of, frankly, in a state like Connecticut, for example. So, with those type of things, you absolutely need a pilot in payment in lieu of taxes, basically real property tax abatements in the state of New York to get a project off the ground, especially residential projects, because the developers are sort of tied to the market rents, and that fluctuates, right? And you're fighting against New York City, so you don't know how those rents might jump or might increase or decrease. So the answer is no, and quite frankly, it's the opposite that's happening. That's sort of to your question. I'm seeing a lot of projects. I have one right now. I won't disclose the particulars, of course, but it's on the verge of dying because the local municipality here in Westchester is just basically saying, look, I'm not going to give you a pilot. And it's not that the people who are dealing with sort of an administration level are opposed to it. It's more, as Rella pointed out, it's the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. They feel their constituents are going to say, one, what are you doing? Or two, we don't need the developer here. They're making money. Let's get rid of them. So it's a tough thing. It's really tough to develop. And now, of course, with the cost of construction, that's really just throwing things out the for a loop. I do want to touch on something that you were just talking about, the affordable housing. And, I had a client who just really opened up my eyes to this a few weeks ago on a particular deal. And affordable housing, as we all know, it's very difficult to construct, to build. It's difficult to rent because you're renting it at sort of lower rents than market. But the cost to build that particular unit is the same cost as to build any other units. So basically mean when you rent out that unit, you're at a loss. So how do you make that up? You make that up with incentives, with a pilot. And so on one hand, and I'm not going to sort of knock anyone, but on one hand, you have politicians saying we need to build affordable housing, we need it. And on the other hand, they're making it quite difficult to get any type of real property tax abatements. So at the end of the day, what they're really saying is, yeah, we want it, but we don't want to sort of help you to kind of get the affordable housing. So.
Noam, I guess the ball is in your court.
Did someone say politician? The point's well taken, and obviously, if we want growth and investment, it has to pencil out. We recognize developers are not charities. At the same time, from a public perspective, we have to be confident that the revenue generated by growth will exceed any additional new public costs, whether with respect to services or infrastructure. We think we have achieved that balance in New Rochelle through the pilot framework that Eon mentioned, as well as through something we call a fair share mitigation fund, which is a one-time payment for capital needs. But it is something we had to think through very carefully up front. And we had to have a serious dialogue with our community, because there are many people who may not necessarily fall into the NIMBY category, recognize the benefits of growth, but do want to be sure that when you get into the weeds and look at the details, the current residents, the current businesses of communities like ours will actually benefit from the investment that's flowing in. And so making sure that we could achieve that balance, I think was critical in terms of the durability of public support for the changes that are now occurring. I also want to come back, if I could, to something that Art said earlier. I think that historic perspective is really interesting. He referenced the wave of growth that occurred in the 80s and 90s, which sort of petered out. And I want to put that maybe in a positive frame, because much of the growth that occurred then was in these car-dependent, car-centric office parks, along places like the 287 corridor, which obviously had a certain value. But I think now the focus is different as people rediscover the virtues of compact, walkable transit served 15-minute neighborhoods where goods and services are all readily accessible, where transportation costs are somewhat lower. And to the extent that the marketplace and the public sector wants to move towards environmental and social governance, we have these areas which provide a regulatory and physical environment in which those investments can really fully flourish. So the change, which may have created some challenges for our region in the post-80s, 90s period, is now opening up new opportunities for urban centers like New Rochelle, like Yonkers, like Mount Vernon, like White Plains, like Peekskill, all these places which have the kind of infrastructure that can support growth, but which have not necessarily previously been seen as ripe for it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. No, this whole idea that of creating a walkable communities, transit-oriented developments. There's many communities that I know that where there's vacant land right next to the train station or excessive parking lots that aren't necessarily used, or obsolete buildings. And as I said earlier, our 3 points are to create, first of all, have a master plan for some of those growth areas. Figure out a way to give some financial incentives through what Eon was talking about with the pilot, and have a pro-business administration where the private investor or private developer will actually share some of the numbers that what the construction costs are, and what needs to happen in order to make the deal work financially and get it financed. And I'm sure that that's part of the conversation that Noam's talking about with the citizenry, that in New Rochelle, essentially we are asked in other communities about our finances and how we are financing these deals. They want to know. And I know that some of my my colleagues in development don't want to share their costs and so forth, but in order to get a pilot, you don't have a choice. And so the process becomes so public that the numbers have just got to come out from the private developer, private investor, to show that the pilot is warranted, or the need for financial incentive is warranted. And that's the way we've done business with a lot of economic development departments that, like Louise Aragon, who was in New Rochelle for many years, he helped verify that without these financial incentives, these incentives, the project would not be able to go forward. So it's been a frustrating process for us as a private developer here in this area, just watching these places, these towns, as I mentioned earlier, with aging housing stock, vacant land, and resist the private investment and the new development for affordable housing, or housing that's affordable in their towns, or redeveloping their transit area. It's just been frustrating, and I'm not sure when the tide is going to turn. Hopefully it does. Otherwise, we're going to be taxed out of our taxed out of the community. So it's something that's very much on our mind, and trying to figure out ways to change that tide.
Yeah, I mean, and just to piggyback what Art said, and I'm happy that, as part of the pilot process, the developers do now have to sort of show their pro forma and show their numbers. And, what you sometimes see, and most of the times is they're okay. You look at their debt service coverage, and they're okay, and they're making, some money when you have incentives and when incentives are provided. As Rella said, with the NIMBY folks, they feel, oh, it's a big developer, it's a $100 million project, they're wealthy, they're rich, they don't need this, and they're making money. And really that's not really, and part of it, I think, folks, is to really sort of change public perception, as well as political perception, and how the narrative is told. And it's not, they're making money, it's $100 million. You have to we're in a capitalist society, so you have to ask yourself, You know, is the developer, is he going to put his equity, and is he going to put his partners, and is he going to get the lender to invest in this project? Does it make sense for them? Are the returns great on this project or good on this project versus taking my money and putting it in the stock market where I might get better returns? And that's ultimately the real question as to whether that project is feasible or not. And providing the numbers sometimes does help to tell that story, but I feel that it's not, you know, often sort of in the public's view as to sort of when someone wants to develop a project and make that project happen.
Let me just add to that if I could, because I think it's necessary but not sufficient to explain why the calculus has to pencil out from a developer perspective, because although it may be self-evident to the kinds of folks who participate on a Zoom like this that growth is in our interest, it is not necessarily self-evident to all the people that I serve. And so constantly bringing it back to what's in it for all of us is, I think, absolutely critical. You know, do we want places to live where our children and grandchildren can look realistically to this region as a place that they can settle? Do we want places where folks can age in place and downsize without leaving the communities and people that they love? Are we able to say to the corporate sector and to businesses that they have a base of employees who have a realistic way to get to work? All of these things are essential to the livability and the competitiveness of our region. And even from the broadest perspective, if we're concerned about things like climate change, then transit-oriented development and growth patterns, which are less car dependent, where you have lower heating and cooling expenses, lower energy needs, that's a critical part of the equation. So I find that things like that, that's a conversation it's necessary for us to have on a constant basis. Because if you are a homeowner in community X and you see a tower rising half a mile away, it's not necessarily immediately clear that your life is going to be improved by that. And so drawing those connections, I think, is critical if we're all going to succeed in making this region what it can and should be.
Now, you talk about transit-oriented development, and many times that's vertical, high-rise. Are you adjusting zoning to require less cars, or does a developer still have to provide outdated zoning, you know, 1 car per unit and then half a car per bedroom of the development plan?
So if that question is directed towards me, I would say we're kind of in between. We have greatly reduced the on-site parking requirements in recognition of the fact that there are a variety of transportation alternatives in a dense transit-served area. We've also created a formula through which developers can further buy down that obligation by providing things like rideshare and so forth. So there's a process through which each project can customize its parking provision to sort of meet the site-specific location, as well as the services and amenities that the developer wants to provide. You know, we're not the heart of Manhattan. And so we recognize that there are going to be a certain number of people who will want a car, will need a car, and we shouldn't be blind to that fact. At the same time, the prevailing wisdom from 10 or 20 years ago that every household is going to own 2 cars is just dead wrong. You've got a whole generation of people who are far less interested in car ownership. And if we overbuild our parking stock, that is space and money that is being poorly directed and directed away from other public goods that are more important to our future. So it's key to get that balance right.
Right. Well, as we talk, sorry, Rella.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting that we're having this conversation now because it's something that I'm facing, and I have been facing with parking. I don't get it, and I'm sorry, but it is true, and I think that there has been a balance reached in New Rochelle where I'm not seeing it in other places. I've built affordable housing for seniors, and I'm not going to mention which municipality it was in, but my goodness, I had to go through 2 years of a zoning variance for just 13 spaces, and then, you know, after it was built and it was free parking, and maybe 30% is used. I'm working on a development also in Westchester, and again, we talk about transit-oriented development, but even for seniors, they want something like 1.75 parking spaces, which is difficult and expensive to do, especially if you're doing affordable housing. You have to take that into consideration into the pro forma, and then it goes unutilized. And and I know that it's gonna go unutilized because of previous experience. So we are wasting a lot of energy and money. And why aren't we trying to incentivize people to use public transportation? I mean, I'm not talking about in areas that that there is none. I'm talking about in areas where there is plenty, and I really don't see needing close to 2 cars per family, because that's not the way that our society is moving. So
Right,
some
yeah.
communities are still very stale with that.
Yeah, so I was going to add to what you're saying, Rella, because, and what Noam's saying, the process for entitlements in all these municipalities, essentially the developer has become conversant with every element of the project. They have to be. Density, school children generation, parking, traffic impact, building height, sun and shadows. I mean, all this stuff comes into play, and we know by virtue of doing it a number of times, what we are generating, but what happens in New York, especially, is with the seeker forms and so forth, the environmental work becomes a public sort of whipping post that or a stick to whip the developer with, and challenge those things that we know better than anyone because we've done it a number of times. And I'm sure Rella could say that, give me a project a half a mile from the train station and I need 1.1 cars, less than 100 yards, I probably need 0.8. I mean, they know because, and so this is the kind of openness that Noam has created in New Rochelle, and they've had to weigh what the citizens, concerns are, but have to also validate that, it's not going to overcrowd the schools or whatever. So this is part of the public process. And all I'm saying is that also the financeability, it has to come into it because it's all related. I'm just hoping that we can, continue to be open and try to create more of a pro-business dialogue with the administrations of the municipalities around in our areas to prove that we know what we're talking about, and for the benefit of all. And I know, again, I think it's worth repeating that people are looking for walkability, a sustainable community, some growth, and some of our retail communities or downtowns are dying because there hasn't been growth, in the past, or new population growth and so forth. So, we're sort of working against ourselves unless we're actually take proactive sort of measures to negotiate what is the proper number of school children, parking, et cetera.
So New York City has seen a tremendous development activity over the last 15, 16 years. That pipeline is slowing down because there hasn't been much planning and rezoning over the last 7 years. I think a lot of the projects that are being topped off now and have been finished in the last few years were the result of the Bloomberg administration. Will Westchester continue to benefit from New York City's lack of planning? Will Westchester become more vertical, or, with the 7,000 units in New Rochelle and the 6,000 units in White Plains and Yonkers, are we going to reach critical mass? What is equilibrium, if it is, or will we continue to grow moving forward?
Well, there's a major housing shortage in New York for housing that's affordable. I mean, you know, many towns you need to make, you know, well over $200,000 just to live there. So, you know, I don't know who's fooling who here. Taxes are going in the wrong direction. You have no population growth, very little job growth, and you know, in Westchester. And so something has got to happen. There's got to be some kind of dynamic that allows you know, private investment to fill that gap.
Look, I'll say, I think there are certainly moments when the trend lines in the 5 boroughs and the trend lines in the surrounding suburbs might move in opposite directions. And we saw that a little bit during the pandemic, as many people looked for housing and business alternatives outside of the metropolitan core. But as a general long-term matter, I think our interests will coincide with those of New York City. We are one integrated region with one integrated transit system. You know, many people, just to use again my community as an example, many people who live in New Rochelle work in New York City, and vice versa. Using Metro North, we're half an hour from Grand Central. That is more proximate to the center of the city than many places in Brooklyn and Queens. So we should be thinking of this challenge holistically. And in some ways, there are kind of reversed issues. There is an affordability crisis in the 5 boroughs, particularly because of an acute housing shortage. And at the same time, out here in the lower Hudson Valley, we're bleeding younger population. The 18 to 30 age group has been deserting us in droves. And we can present an attractive housing product at a fraction of what it'll cost in Manhattan or Brooklyn, and reattract the kinds of younger people who are our future. And that's good for everybody. It helps relieve housing pressures in New York City. It helps bring life and energy to our downtowns. It provides that range of price points for people of different means. So thinking about how we support each other, I think, is going to be a helpful way forward.
I agree with that. You know, what Noam said. I mean, there are opportunities, I think, for Westchester and the surrounding region. You know, my question is sort of going back to a little bit what Art was touching on, and it's sort of timing, right? Because, you know, of the secret process and the approval process, it takes such a long time in most parts of Westchester to get a project off the ground. And we now have, as you're pointing out, John, this sort of change in conditions that's occurring. And can we capitalize on it right now? You know, so you have that on one hand, you have sort of the interest rates, which have been historically low for a really long time, which is making a lot of these projects, you know, feasible. You know, if that climbs, when it climbs, if it climbs, what does that mean then? You know, given the cost to develop here. So these are things that I think, yeah, we can capitalize on it, but I think the time is now or in the immediate future. We can't expect these conditions to remain, you know, for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It's not going to happen. Folks are going to do what they've been doing. They're going to go to other parts of the country, other regions.
Can we capitalize on the recently passed infrastructure bill? What kind of money might the region see?
Well, I think the infrastructure bill, it's important for the whole country, but maybe particularly important to New York. You know, transit is the lifeblood of the region, and it's going to receive a bigger federal infusion than it has in memory. When you think about the upgrade of the Amtrak Northeast Corridor, that's obviously important to many of us. The Gateway project, which will provide some sustainability for our supply chain and goods connections to the rest of the continental United States. I mean, that's above and beyond traditional road and highway projects. And I'll also use, again, another example from my community. We just received this week a $12 million grant from the Department of Transportation to repurpose an overbuilt 6-lane highway to nowhere into a linear park that will be a significant open space amenity, which is important as we add to density, and will also provide better connections to the transit hub and to employment centers for some of the surrounding neighborhoods. Now, that's not funded through the new infrastructure bill. To be clear, that comes through a pre-existing program called RAISE, but it was extremely competitive because the resources available to the feds were such a small fraction of the need. And so as a result of the infrastructure bill, it's the kind of project that the federal government will be able to support on a much more extensive basis in communities around this region and around the country.
Great. So we do have, as part of our audience today, some students from Fordham University, their real estate program. Does anybody have any advice to wannabe developers out there on a path forward?
I would say work for a developer first and absorb as much as possible. I think that it's very important to just, in today's world, to start on your own is extremely difficult. What I was going to touch on as well is one of the impediments today that we're facing that I did not have to face back in the late 80s and early 90s is the cost of land. And I think that that's had a really large impact. So to just try to explode on the market, I think that the best thing to do would be to work for a development firm and, get your feet wet, get your sea legs.
I would say hire a good lawyer.
Of course you would. As someone who knows a lot about affordable housing, you stole my thunder earlier, but that's okay, yeah.
Now, what I would really say, look, my just kind of seeing how my clients go through stuff is I think you just need look to develop, as Mr. Mayor said earlier, and build a community. It's something exceptional, and developers really should be commended for that. Because they're putting something in place that's going to last hopefully for centuries, and there's a lot to be said for that. I think to the students, you need patience, and you need to be able to persevere, because it's not easy. It's an up and down, and it's lengthy, and you have to kind of stay in there and stick with it.
Yeah, my advice is align with a capital source and figure that out first, because this is a process, especially around the New York area, that is capital intensive.
And do all projects stand on their own merits? Or if you've got a long-term relationship with someone, can you sometimes get something financed that maybe, a little questionable?
It really comes down to the economics and the returns. And as Eon mentioned, if interest rates start to rise and cap rates start to rise, it's going to affect the costs. And hopefully it's going to happen, and it'll tamp down some of the construction cost excesses that have that we've seen in this market.
Okay, we've got a question from the audience now. Are there any, with the exception of New Rochelle, are there any streamlining steps that any municipalities have taken at the local level that have been helpful in making affordable housing projects move forward? For example, pre-application conferences or concurrent application review, any expedited project review that any of the panelists are aware of?
I mean, I can jump in from what I've seen. The answer is no. I mean, we at least from what I've seen, and I'm just full disclosure, I'm not a land use and real estate attorney. My partners do that, but my understanding of the process is no. I mean, we have a client that they do a tremendous, like Rella, affordable housing projects, and when you all affordable, when you do that, those projects take a very long time. You need funding sources from various sources, and they're quite sophisticated and complicated. And so there isn't anything that's streamlined about that. That's actually quite the opposite than a regular market rate development. So it's not, when you're doing affordable, wow, there's a quick and easy process. It's quite the opposite from what I've seen. Maybe Rella, you can comment on that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I am seeing, since we're excluding New Rochelle because of all the kudos already, and well-deserved, but I would say that I call them friendly communities, right? So I agree with you, Eon. It's never streamlined, right? Because we're dependent not only on the municipality or the village or the town, but we're also We also have to speak to the other forces such as financing through the state, which would be the case in Westchester, and there's so many parts. But I would say that Yonkers is now, I would say, a friendlier, more open-minded city to develop affordable mixed income, mixed use. I think that it's coming into its own after having developed the waterfront entirely as market rate. So I see that as, I think it's now a lot easier than when I built 15 years ago in Yonkers. I think that they're, you know, really coming around and being more approachable.
Okay. Andy, do you have any questions?
No. I just wanted to thank everyone for these wonderful insights. And I can think of at least 5 different follow-up events we could possibly have on transit-oriented development or infrastructure or moving demographics. You know, I invite everyone who has attended to send some ideas to HGAR or to Fordham, and HGAR is hello@hgar.com and Fordham is real estate at fordham.edu. I'd love to continue these conversations. So interesting. Thank you to all the panelists.
Andy, we're getting another question here that says, can people get a recording of this to circulate to others? Where will this session be?
So we will, yes, there is a recording. The session has been recorded and we'll post it on HGAR and on Fordham's website. Okay, so that's fordham.edu/real estate and HGAR, I assume in their event section.
Correct.
Great. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all our panelists. Your insight was absolutely fantastic. And we hope to have you back in person next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.